All right, guys, this is chapter 1, Mapping Global Frontiers to 1590. You're going to notice we're going to go pretty far back in the past, about 38,000 BCE, and then we're going to march our way all the way up to the year 1590. And in this chapter, you're going to notice you probably know a lot of this stuff already. You probably learned about this growing up, so some of it will seem very familiar to you. Other things, hopefully, you've never heard about, and that's the great thing about this chapter. It kind of introduces us to old topics and old but new to us topics as we move throughout this chapter. All right, Native peoples develop diverse cultures is our first kind of subtopic within this chapter. And between about 38,000 and 14,000 BCE, and BCE stands for Before Common Era, it used to be called BC, peoples from Northeast Asia migrated to the Americas following game, like big game hunting. During the Ice Age, polar glaciers moved south, creating a land bridge known as Beringia between Asia, that part of Asia, we call it Siberia, and Alaska, and that allowed both settlers and animals to move into North America. Most early migrants moved southward by both land and by sea. And we're going to look at a map in just a minute to see those sea routes that they took and what they were doing. They were searching for food. The last migrants across the Bering Strait or Beringia before it melted were known as Inuit and the Aleut peoples, who arrived about, we estimate about 5,000 years ago. Agricultural systems began to develop in the Americas about 3,000 years ago, and that led to more stability. When you can plant food and grow it and provide enough food for your village, for your community, for your city, then you don't have to continue moving around more. And with the development of agriculture, we see the development of complex societies now. And by about 500 CE, or Common Era, that's what we used to call AD, complex societies thrive in the equatorial regions. And by 1500, thousands of separate societies with different languages and different levels of political and cultural development had arisen in the Americas. Now, these three major civilizations, hopefully you've grown up hearing about these, you know about them, you've studied them before, this is nothing new. But the three major civilizations that had developed by the early 16th century, really in Central and South America, were known as the Aztecs and the Mayan in the equatorial region, and then the Incas along the Pacific coast in what is now modern-day Peru. All were very wealthy and technologically advanced in many areas, and they had created large cities with complex political and social systems. They did not develop the wheel, nor did they have steel weapons or horses. Around 1325, the Aztecs, they built Tenochtitlan, adapting the local residents' written language and agricultural techniques, and they had also established a hierarchical society and a vast trading network. And what a hierarchy means is they did have a leader, and then they had people under that leader or leaders, and then kind of below them were your everyday working group, and then below them usually were your slaves. So we do see a hierarchy. We do see someone reporting to someone on high and someone kind of ruling over and kind of disseminating information throughout this hierarchy. The Maya, they settled the Yucatan Peninsula and the rainforests of Guatemala between 900 BCE and 300 CE. They established large cities with complex infrastructures, they built large temples, and they developed systems of mathematics and astronomy. Mayan civilization, it began to decline around 800 as drought and heavy taxation drove peasant families inland, and many cities were abandoned, but those that survived emerged as city-states. City-states probably really familiar, like in Greece, think of like Athens, that later traded with the Aztecs. Inca civilization developed in the Andes Mountains and, like the Aztec civilization, was built on the accomplishment of earlier societies. The extensive road system from the Inca capital, Cuzco, encouraged trade and military expeditions. Then in the 15th century, the Inca Empire controlled a population of 16 million people and a territory of 350,000 square miles. The Incas were very successful in cultivating the mountain valleys. Cuzco was high above sea level with valleys on either side of it, really great for protection. The Incas harvested timber, they grew crops using sophisticated irrigated terrace systems, they crafted jewelry, pottery, and textiles, and excelled in stone carving. And we do have evidence that they also practiced human sacrifice. So this is map 1.1. This is a map that can be found in your textbook or found in the ebook online. And what it's showing is the land bridge Beringia that connected Asia, that part of Siberia, to Alaska. So we see here the land routes coming over and walking. And then we also have these water routes that hug the coastline and they sail down the coastline as well, all the way down the North American coast, Central, and then down into South America. And this just kind of gives you an idea of the type of landscape that they would have come into contact with. These ice sheets, and then the frozen tundra, the conifer forests, prairies and deserts, that kind of thing that our ancestors came into contact with. And again, keep in mind they were, chasing large game or hunting big game that came across also on those ice sheets. So these are native cultures to North America. Hopefully you've heard of some of these. We don't really do them a whole lot of due justice when we talk about American history. But here in North America, we have the following native cultures. We have the Migian and the Hohokam societies with less elaborate cultures. They developed in North America beginning around 500 CE. The ancient Pueblo people first settled in present-day Utah and Colorado around 750. Later, the Pueblo moved south where they constructed a larger and more complex society. However, they suffered through two prolonged droughts between the 12th and the 14th century, and that really prompted the Pueblo to move back to their cliff dwellings and then eventually forced them to disperse into smaller groups. They couldn't just really handle large populations anymore. On the plains that stretch from Colorado into Canada, societies developed around hunting bison. Hunters also developed various techniques and tools for capturing smaller game. These hunting, gathering societies typically stayed small and they ranged over a large territory. Other native societies like the Mandan settled along rivers in the heart of the continent and cultivated the rich soil and diverse game of the area. Around 1250, the Mandan villages shrank, much like the Pueblo, due to an extended drought and increased competition for food. Hunting-gathering societies that developed along the Pacific coast were able to create permanent settlements because they could get food from both the land and the ocean. The Chumash, for example, developed large villages and an extensive trading network. Hopewell culture developed near the Mississippi River. The river provided agricultural stability and easy transportation, and Hopewell communities in southern Ohio and western Illinois sometimes topped 6,000 people, and their trading network extended northward into the Great Lakes, westward into the Rocky Mountains, and eastward to the Appalachians in Florida. Beginning around 500, the Hopewell culture evolved into a more complex society in the Mississippi River Valley. Corn cultivation, that really allowed exponential population growth and hierarchical religious and political development. Mississippians created massive ceremonial earthworks that are still visible today. So just FYI, when you think about ancient peoples, sometimes what comes to mind are pyramids. And probably when I say the word pyramid, you think about the pyramids in Egypt. Not all pyramids look like the ones in Egypt. Think about the Central American societies. They had step pyramids. And we see step pyramids kind of throughout the world in India and in parts of Asia. Here in North America, we didn't build pyramids. We built mounds. We were mound builders. I'm going to show you an example of a mound in just a second. But that was kind of those ceremonial earthworks that they're talking about. Those are the mounds that we still see today. By about 1100, Cahokia had become a major community with a population of 15,000 people. Although powerful chieftains extended their political and economic influence and created a centralized government, environmental factors such as deforestation, drought, and overhunting led to political instability and warfare. And these circumstances ultimately led to the decline of the Mississippian culture after 1400. So it's kind of like when we have European contact in the late 1400s, early 1500s, we don't really talk much about North American contact and what was going on. Well, because a lot of our complex societies that were thriving and growing at that time, they had all, or before that time, they had all declined by the time we see Europeans making their way. When Europeans get here, the natives are kind of in these small villages, not really these huge cities that hosted thousands of people like we had in the 12th and 13th centuries. So that's why there's not a lot of talk sometimes about these civilizations, because they were just gone by the point of European contact. But to give you an idea of where they were, where these civilizations had thrived before have this really cool map. I think maps are cool, you guys may not. In the Utah, Colorado area, we have the Anasazi, ancient ones, or the Pueblo, as your book refers to them. We have the Hohokam. Here we have the Magean. And then also over here to the right, we have Cahokia. That was one of those large Mississippian cities. And then Serpent Mound, I'll give you an example of Serpent Mound. Those were one of the earthworks that natives here in North America had built. And then also down here, we can't forget about the Aztec and the Mayan. And then, the Incas are going to be down here along the coast in South America and Peru. Just kind of showing you like very spread out, and look at how large this territory was. I mean, these are very complex societies that are able to extend into the Appalachian Mountains, down into Florida, all the way over into the Rockies areas, like trading with each other as well. Here is a picture of Serpent Mound. And if you can't see it, this is the tail of the serpent kind of coiled up. And then it extends, and this is the body of the serpent kind of weaving its way back and forth. And then here is the head of the serpent, and its mouth is open, and it looks like it's swallowing like an egg, maybe. But this would have it does line up with the stars in the sky. We know that this was used probably for religious beliefs and ceremonies that dealt with astronomy. Some other mound works are not quite this intricate. Really, they're just like big piles of dirt, what they look like from the outside, and they would have had tunnels dug into them. They would have been used to bury the dead, or also for religious ceremonies. Sometimes they were flat on top, and you could go up and they would have like a religious ceremony up top. So that's what we are known for, not for these huge pyramids, but for these really cool designs in the earth. All right, now we're going to go over and talk about what's happening in Europe, and specifically this part is dealing with the Mediterranean world. And how did we go from being closed in the Mediterranean world and in Europe to suddenly, like, what was the purpose of us going to the Western Hemisphere and rediscovering these two continents that had been closed off to us for centuries? So by the 9th century, Islam had expanded throughout Southwest Asia and North Africa, and had even come into parts of Europe, specifically Spain. In the 11th and the 12th centuries, European Catholics, they launched the Crusades to reclaim the Holy Land. And these campaigns generally failed, but they did help create new opportunities for trade in the East and also intrigued adventurers throughout Europe. Europeans learned new economic systems from the Middle East that depended on technological advances in irrigation and navigation, and included an extensive slave trading network that enhanced agricultural production. Productive agricultural development allowed Middle Eastern societies to excel in astronomy, mathematics, architecture, and the arts. European states were less able to prevent human and environmental disasters than were the Mediterranean states. In the 1340s alone, the Black Death, also known as the bubonic plague, brought from Asia by European sailors and by rats stowed away on ships, killed some 36 million people, about half of Europe's population at that time. A century-long warfare between England and France only increased that devastation. By the early 15th century, the European climate, it had improved, and the plague had largely ended, leading to an improved standard of living, which in turn fueled a resurgence of trade. A cultural renaissance spread throughout Europe as the profits from trade were invested in art, literature, and music. European rulers consolidated their power. Ferdinand and Isabella unified Spain. They expelled Muslims and Jews from the Iberian Peninsula by 1492. They had launched the Inquisition. You've probably heard of the Spanish Inquisition before. And they reinvigorated trade with North Africa, India, and other Asian lands. Italy controlled the Mediterranean trade routes, forcing the Spanish and the Portuguese to seek out alternate routes to India and the Far East. They were aided by explorers and missionaries who traveled to distant lands and brought back new technologies, such as shipbuilding and map-making, that allowed the exploration of the African coast and eventually the Atlantic Ocean. Trading with the Asian market, that's really going to open up a lot of this new exploration, because as we said in the previous slide, Italy controlled the Mediterranean. We're going to look at a map in just a minute that kind of shows you where all these places are. But if you can't get through the Mediterranean, or if you want to go through the Mediterranean to get into those Asian markets, you've got to pay off the Italians for passage through the Mediterranean. Then once you get to the end of the Mediterranean Sea, you're going to have to pay the Ottoman Empire, or the Turks, to go through their lands on foot. And then as you go through, eventually you'll reach India. You're going to have to pay off people along the way. So it gets very expensive paying for safe passage, and sometimes it's not really safe passage that you're paying for. But it's easier to cut out all these middlemen and to hopefully find a quicker, faster route from Europe to Asia. And that's what Henry the Navigator is going to do. He's the Prince of Portugal, and he wanted to find a quick route to India. And he consulted with astronomers, geographers, cartographers, those are map makers, navigators, scholars, sailors, and captains before launching a systematic campaign of exploration and trade. And he helped develop caravels, or sailing vessels, that were especially effective for navigating the West African coast. His men also developed more accurate navigational instruments. And thanks to all of these efforts, Portugal established a very lucrative trade in African gold, ivory, unfortunately slaves, and its ships traveled as far east as Cape Verde. Portugal is going to build a castle. It's known as Elmina Castle, and it was built in 1482 in present-day Ghana. It's really important because it's not really a castle. I mean, it looks like a castle, but really this was a fort, and this was the trading hub for slaves. Slaves would make it to Elmina Castle, and once they made it there, most of the time they never saw the African continent again because they're sold to Europe or they're sold to the Americas. In 1487, Bartolomeu Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope on the southernmost tip of Africa, and Vasco da Gama, he ventured to India 10 years later, so 1497. We've made it all the way around Africa and up into India. Portugal took control of the India trade by the early 16th century, and they established posts on the Indian Ocean, and they traded with Indonesia, China, and Japan. Other European nations competed for international trade routes to satisfy Europe's desire for these luxury goods coming out of India and Asia. And they developed long-distance markets as well as more efficient taxation systems and larger armies. The major European cities developed as centers of trade and a new system of market exchange and capital accumulation. The African slave trade became extremely lucrative, and the definition of slavery is going to start to change as it expands. So there's several important things I want to show you. This map, or this is an example of a primary source. This map came out in 1507. And look at how detailed Europe and Africa and most of Asia is. And just really quickly, here's Italy, right? They control all of the Mediterranean. So if you're here in Spain and you want to get to over here in Asia, you're going to have to go through them. At the time, the easiest route was to go through the Mediterranean, into the Ottoman Empire, over this area, into India, and then into Asia. What they're doing in Portugal, that runs here along Spain, they're actually searching all of this and mapping the African coast, and what they're looking for is a river that cuts all the way through Africa. That would give them access to the Indian Ocean and eventually into Asia. They don't find a waterway that cuts all the way through Africa. The other important thing I want to point out about this map is look at South and North America. In 1507, we didn't really know a lot about North America, right? You can tell the continent is not all there. It's just really like the East Coast. A lot of these Caribbean islands, they have been mapped out. And then here you can see in detail, European contact first came in the Caribbean, and then a lot of it was in Central and South America. That's why South America is more detailed, and we know more about South America than we do North America. Eventually, though, this map will get better, obviously. This is 1507, and more detail will come out about the Western Hemisphere. Let's talk about European encounters with West Africa for a few minutes. So the slave trade, it had expanded greatly by 1500 as Africans were increasingly viewed as a labor force rather than curiosities. So go back and read a little bit in your book about why Africans were curiosities. Europeans were more familiar with North Africa, but the slave trade brought Europeans in contact with communities in West Africa. Most slaves came from communities conquered by their powerful neighbors. Their unfamiliar religious traditions and cultures and their lack of wealth or possessions eventually became the template by which Europe judged all of Africa. With more contact, European artists began to portray Africans as being more ape-like than human. And European Christians believed that Africans were the descendants of the biblical figure Canaan, who Noah cursed as a slave. European images, what they failed to do is capture the diversity of West Africa and the diversity of the presence of city-states and trading networks that had emerged with agricultural productivity. The expansion of the slave trade, it severely destabilized Western and Central Africa. And what we see are some powerful African leaders shaping the slave trade, and their decisions ran counter to some African traditions. So for example, women were valued as slaves in Muslim areas, but African societies were matrilineal and opposed the enslavement of women. Here in Western culture, specifically, here in North America, we are a patriarchal society. We follow the father's line, and that's a very biblical thing. Typically, the father, the man, is the head of household, but in a lot of African societies, the mother was the head of the household. And so you would not enslave a woman in African societies. But we're going to start to see that change, and as we all know, men, women, and children are going to be enslaved. Both Africans and Europeans eventually will enslave men, women, and children. In perpetual slavery, it didn't develop immediately, and perpetual means being passed from one generation to the next. You weren't born into slavery, although we're going to start to see that taking effect in the 1500s and the 1600s. Africans were treated as another form of bound labor, like indentured servants. So they could get out, they would serve, or they would be enslaved for 5 to 7 years, and then that enslavement would end. And that's exactly what indentured servants were like, and I think we talked about that in chapter 2. And it's really important to note here, this very last thing on this slide, the association of slavery with race had not developed. So there was no, if you're black, you're a slave. That wasn't part of society just yet. Europeans believed that laborers of all races or of a lower class. So we're going to see Europeans are slaves, Africans are slaves. Eventually we're going to see Native Americans will become slaves. It all just dealt with your stature in life. If you were of that lower class, you were probably at some point a slave. Irish and African laborers, they were regarded as unruly infidels, and only after the colonization of Americas and the resulting increase in demand for labor would ideas regarding race and slavery start to change. So let's talk about Europeans across the Atlantic. We're going to go back in time a little bit, and then we're going to talk about Christopher Columbus. But Norsemen, also known as Vikings, were the first Europeans to cross the Atlantic, hopping from Ireland to Iceland to Greenland by the 10th century, really about 500 years before Columbus. Sailing even further west was Leif Erikson, also he was the descendant of Eric the Red, and he discovered Vinland near the Gulf of St. Lawrence, that's in Canada, and established a settlement there around the year 1000. The Norse settlements in Greenland, they had disappeared by 1450 though, about 4 decades before Columbus. So and only recently were we able to discover these. They found like some mounds and some burial pits of what the Vikings had established and where they had established in the North American continent. But again, it was 500 years before Columbus, and that was all kind of lost to history until really the 20th century when it was rediscovered. Then the expulsion of Muslims in 1492 gave Spain the ability to really begin to expand its empire. And Queen Isabella, she helped finance Christopher Columbus's first voyage. And what he was trying to do was find a new trade route to Asia by sailing west across the Atlantic, instead of going east, across the Mediterranean, or south along the African coast. And he believed that he could sail from Spain to Asia in a month. After sailing for a month without seeing land, Columbus's crew, they almost revolted, but that mutiny or revolt was averted when land was sighted on October the 12th. Columbus thought he was in the East Indies because he had read part of Marco Polo's diaries, and it talked about these islands and these people that had darker skin tones than Europeans, and they spoke this funny language, and he really believed that he was in the East Indies. And so he called the inhabitants Indians, and he believed them to be quite wealthy. He went on to explore Cuba and Hispaniola, and he was convinced that he had reached Asia when he returned to Spain. Columbus's discoveries that led the Pope to divide this non-Christian world between Spain and Portugal, and Spain received all of South America except for Brazil, and this was in the Treaty of Tordesillas. And one thing about Columbus, even when he dies, he still thinks that he has found a quicker route to Asia. He does not realize that he has opened up North and South America to the rest of the world. And I want to point something else out. Columbus never sets foot in North or South America. He only makes it to the Caribbean islands. But what this leads to is Europeans are going to begin to explore the Americas, and then they very quickly realize they're in a whole new place. They're not in Asia. And Columbus, he goes back to the Caribbean, and what he's trying to do is establish a stable agrarian society. But his men wanted gold, and eventually they're going to use force to get it. And Columbus was forced to initiate the encomienda system. You can read about that in your book. I want you to go back and read about that, the encomienda system, and what exactly that means. But by Columbus's death in 1506, the islands he discovered were dissolving into chaos as violence increased between the Indians and European traders, and no one still believed that he had discovered a new trade route to China. Inspired by Columbus, John Cabot sailed west for the English crown and discovered an island off of Cape Breton in 1497. Spain and Portugal continued explorations in the Caribbean. Amerigo Vespucci recognized the discovery of a new continent, and that led a map maker to name the land America in his first map of the world in 1507. In 1513, Vasco Núñez de Balboa crossed the Isthmus of Darien, now Panama, and became the first European to see the Pacific Ocean. Juan Ponce de Leon claimed Florida for Spain that same year in 1513. In 1519, Ferdinand Magellan started an expedition to find a passage to Asia through South America. While en route, he and his crew faced many challenges, but they eventually made it to Guam and then the Philippines in 1521. Magellan died in the Philippines, and only one of his 5 ships made it back to Spain in 1522. But Magellan's voyage provided the valuable knowledge to cartographers and allowed Spain to claim the Philippine Islands. Here you can see Spanish dominance in exploration of the New World or of the Western Hemisphere. You can see all these different voyages and where they left out from. You can see Magellan taking off here, coming around and sailing. So his crew circumnavigated the globe, which was kind of cool. You also have a couple of the French. They're doing some explorations. Not really successful. They don't have any permanent settlements just yet. And then, of course, the English. St. Lawrence Bay, here's Cabot. You can really tell Spain had the money and the means to do these explorations in the 14 and 1500s. Just very quickly, want to mention map making and printing. As I said before, cartographers, those are map makers, but they use data from explorers to create more accurate maps of the newly discovered areas. And the invention of the printing press with movable type in the 15th century and the development of cheaper paper, that really increased the availability of printed texts and maps throughout all of Europe. Native Americans had their own way of disseminating knowledge, though. Most written texts only communicated knowledge to local groups, but the extensive trading networks of settled civilizations, it does suggest that these groups had some method of mapping natural features over large distances. So they're not going to be as detailed, and there's a lot more religious tones to Native American maps than you're going to see very specific, accurate maps with Europeans. And we'll look at the two, kind of a contrast of what you're probably used to in a few minutes. So the Columbian Exchange. This is really important. This is an important concept that I hope you really understand and get. And if not, then this is your time, either if you're in online to ask questions about the Columbian Exchange, or if you come to class to ask questions about what exactly is the Columbian Exchange. So Spain's conquest of the Americas, it owed as much to germs as it did to warfare. We're all very familiar with germs with the pandemic of 2020, right? By 1650, tens of millions of native peoples had died as disease spread throughout the Caribbean and Mexico and northward into North America. So the Columbian exchange, it involved not just diseases. We're going to look at this uneven exchange of disease in the Columbian exchange. But also we do see exchanging of plants, animals, and seeds. That's kind of a good thing, and it affected a lot of Africa and Asia, as well as Europe and the Americas. Eventually, the economies and environments everywhere changed, but initially the most devastating impact was in the Americas. We got the short end of the stick. Africans' partial immunity to malaria and yellow fever made them attractive to European seeking labor force for the Caribbean after the native population there was decimated. American maize and potatoes were transplanted to Europe, as were the gold and silver of the Aztec and Inca empires. The inflow of wealth ensured Spain's global dominance. New grain crops, domesticated farm animals, and honeybees came to the Americas from Europe and transformed the landscape. Sugar, cacao, and tobacco were in high demand in Europe, and that demand led to the need for more slaves, which ensured the expansion of the slave trade. Here's a visual of the Columbian exchange for you. So you can see here kind of this even exchange of plants and animals back and forth between the Americas and Europe, Africa, and the Mediterranean. So here in America, we gave the rest of the world beans, cacao, corn, pineapples, potatoes, pumpkins, squash, and turkeys. We got from the Mediterranean, Africa, and European world, we got chickens, horses, lemons, oranges, pigs, rice, and wheat. Horses are, you're probably thinking like Native Americans, they are really adapted to horse life, especially like the Apache and those Plains Indians, really took hold of those horses and used them in warfare and in everyday life. Down here is the uneven exchange of disease. So we gave the rest of the world syphilis, you're welcome, but the rest of the world gave the natives here diphtheria, influenza, malaria, measles, smallpox, and typhus, and that's really what wipes out half of the native population. The other half comes from warfare. But this is going to have a major impact on Native Americans and their well-being. So other than disease, we're going to talk about how the Spaniards were able to conquer these Indian empires. So Spanish leaders in the New World gained authority by dividing up land and Indian labor among their subordinates. So they would come in using warfare or sometimes disease would conquer Native Americans, and then those that were still alive or survived, they would break up their land, and these military leaders would take over parts of that land. Hernan Cortez, he didn't have any authority to attack native peoples or claim land for himself. What he did was he made alliances with outlying tribes who were willing to join with him and attack the powerful Aztecs. The Spanish were awed by Aztec society, and they became convinced that the Aztecs had this vast wealth. So Cortez, he marched into Tenochtitlan in 1519. And what happens there is the way that Tenochtitlan was built, it was in the middle of a lake, and they provided for themselves very well. They had enough food on that island in the middle of the lake to remain and kind of hold off the Spanish for 2 years. But eventually, he's able to conquer the city, the capital, in 1521 with the help from neighboring tribes, and also a smallpox epidemic broke out and killed off a lot of the population. And Cortez claimed the region as New Spain. The Spanish had similar successes in Peru. In 1524, Francisco Pizarro conquered the Incas, a victory that gave the Spanish access to the vast supplies of silver. So the Spanish are able to conquer most of Central and South America, and then they're going to begin heading north. And Spanish soldiers are led by Narvaez and Cabeza de Vaca, explored the Gulf Coast from Florida's Tampa Bay, and they encountered many obstacles, but they do make it as far as Galveston. In 1539, a North African named Esteban tried to find the fabled 7 cities of gold, but he was killed by natives. The surviving men continued to spread stories of their searches and of these wealthy cities in the area. So Francisco Vázquez de Coronado, he was angered to discover that the 7 cities of gold were really just 7 little villages, and so he and his men terrorized and plundered the region. De Soto journeyed to Florida in 1539, He established a village near Tampa Bay before leading an expedition to explore present-day Georgia and Alabama. Despite the loss of men and supplies, including De Soto himself, the group became the first Europeans to see the Mississippi River. The 4-year expedition, led by De Soto's company, introduced disease into new areas. It's going to kill off a lot of the native population, but it also expanded Spanish claims into North America. In 1565, De Avila established St. Augustine, the first permanent European settlement in North America, and it served as a model for future Spanish missions. Just want to point out, St. Augustine is our oldest European settlement that is still around in the United States today. That success really inspired similar attempts by the French and the English. And in 1524, Giovanni de Verrazzano led a French expedition from North Carolina all the way up to New York Harbor and then continued north, claiming all the coastal lands for France. In 1534, Jacques Cartier sailed into the Gulf of St. Lawrence and pushed deep into Canada, looking for a passage to the Pacific, and established an initial settlement at Quebec in 1542. It doesn't last very long, it does fail. England, their first ventures, they're financed not by the crown, but by English wealthy noblemen. English attempts to colonize Newfoundland in 1538 and in Maine in 1584, they both fail. So we don't have any permanent, and I just noticed right there, Maine, it should be F-A-I-L at the end here, fail. Both of those, we don't have any permanent settlements, by the French or by the English in the 1500s. Those are going to come later on in the 1600s. Although we do see Sir Walter Raleigh, he does finance a settlement on land he called Virginia, named after the Virgin Queen, Queen Elizabeth I. She's a Virgin Queen because she never marries. A group of soldiers founded a colony on Roanoke Island to assert English claims and launch attacks on Spanish ships, and that settlement only lasted for a year. So in 1587, Raleigh sent a second group to Roanoke Island, and this group of men, women, and children, they disappeared 3 years later in 1590. This is known as the Lost Colony. No one knows really what happened. So at that point, 1590, only Spain had established permanent colonies in Americas by 1590. And you'll notice that permanent colony, the first one, is St. Augustine. Between 1500 and 1650, more than 180 tons of gold and 16,000 tons of silver arrived in Spain from the Americas. The Spanish elite spent most of it on conspicuous consumption. The influx of precious metals also caused inflation. Spain got really rich off of gold and silver coming from the Americas. The poor could count on employment as either soldiers or sailors. As Spain began to expand its grip on Europe and Africa, that wealth coming from the Americas helped them go in and be able to fund military expeditions into Europe and Africa. Spain engaged in a vigorous internal debate between church and state leaders about the necessity to convert Native Americans and treat them humanely, as opposed to exploiting them for economic gain. So one of those debates, in 1550, Bartolomé de las Casas, he exposed this widespread exploitation and the cruelty toward Native peoples, and he suggested the use of African slaves instead. And there's another gentleman, Juan. He believed that Spain had every right to, quote, civilize, unquote, the natives, particularly if they did not recognize Spanish authority. And then Theodore de Bry, he shaped European views by portraying the natives as subhuman savages. So it's really easy if you don't consider a group of people as human. We consider them savages and subhuman and they're childlike, or they, then it's easier for you to mistreat them. We see that happening with Native Americans, and we also are going to see that happening with African slaves. Riches from America increasingly reached other nations and empires. The Netherlands became a center for Spanish shipbuilding and trade, and the desire for a greater share of America sparked new imperial visions in France, England, and the Netherlands. They're like, hey, if Spain's getting that much gold and silver, there's no reason for us not to be getting in on that too and trying to expand and grow our empire and getting rich like the Spanish are. So that's really fueling this desire for competition and this desire for wealth and this desire for expanding the empire into the Americas. And in the next chapter, that's what we're going to talk about in chapter 2. Kind of, yes, English's grasp on that and coming in, and kind of doing what the Spanish were doing, but on the East Coast. And we'll talk about why the Spanish disappear from the East Coast and are really in the Southwest. We'll talk a little bit about the French, and we'll talk a little bit about the Dutch as well in chapter 2.